Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our weekly podcast, Palestine This Week, the show where we unpack the key issues from Palestine and the wider region. As always, I am joined by my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, thank you for joining us.
And thank you very much for having me, Nasim. It's always a pleasure.
Likewise, I want to kick off this week with the so-called humanitarian city, which is nothing but another plan for a concentration camp, and then move to some of the other stories related to that story, notably the involvement of the Tony Blair Institute or Foundation. And I want to also get your thoughts on a new legal paper that was published by, of all people, one of the members of Israel's legal defense team at the ICJ case, Professor Eyal Benvenisti. He's given his opinion on the concentration camps, and he said that's illegal. It's a violation of international law. So I want to get your thoughts on that. And I thought, it's quite a remarkable intervention by someone who was part of Israel's defense team in the ICJ South African genocide case. And then we'll move to some of the other regional issues. But as I said, let's kick off with the what the Israelis are calling euphemistically a humanitarian city. And of course, in reality, it's nothing but that. It's really a concentration camp. And to me, it seems like this is the conclusion, or this is the end goal, which many of us have been predicting and fearing, that Israel will eventually shepherd all the Palestinians into southern Gaza in the hope of eventually ethnically cleansing them out of this strip. So I want to get your thoughts on that. And is that where we are at the moment, this end stage of seeking to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from the Gaza Strip?
Yes, I mean the Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz made a very proud announcement that it's Israel's intention to concentrate the entire population of the Gaza Strip in a camp on the ruins of what was once the city of Rafah. He used the word concentrate and camps with zero self-awareness. And it's quite clear what Israel intends to do. You gather an entire population in what will literally be a concentration camp. It will be impossible for them to survive in any meaningful way there while Israel completes the physical destruction of the rest of the Gaza Strip. And then Israel has two options, either to forcibly expel the Palestinians who it has concentrated in this camp en masse to Egypt's Sinai desert, and failing that because of Egyptian and perhaps broader regional opposition, I don't think there will be much Western dissent from this plan. Create a situation, as we've discussed before, akin to that which you had in Syria during its war, where there is no direct government policy or decree to collectively expel the population, but people find that the risks to their lives, to that of their families, their ability to have a meaningful life, to survive, and so on, leave them with no choice but to try to leave in any way possible. That is, of course, if Israel gets its way. So we will start to see dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of Palestinians, getting in leaky rafts, trying to make it to Cyprus or Egypt or wherever. And many will, of course, once again drown in the sea. And then Israel will try to perhaps offer these people opportunities to go to, Rwanda or some island in the South Pacific or whatever. The only problem with this, of course, is that Palestinians who, like anyone else, would like to get out of the way of danger, would like to have a meaningful life and care very deeply about the safety and well-being of their children, also recognize that once they leave the Gaza Strip, it's a one-way exit, and they will never, ever be permitted to return so long as the state of Israel continues to exist. And therefore, given that this will be a very heavily politicized act of ethnic cleansing rather than the kind of normal refugee flows one sees during a war armed conflict, where upon its conclusion, people either voluntarily return or voluntarily decide to remain abroad for the longer term. I think there will be a larger determination than in other situations by these Palestinians to remain in place. To what extent they will or won't do so is, of course, impossible to predict. But all this now is also taking place in the context of negotiations, potentially for a new ceasefire, which would also see Israeli troops begin to withdraw from at least significant parts of the Gaza Strip. And if the Palestinians succeed in compelling Israel to accept such an agreement, then it will be very difficult to either establish this concentration camp, fill it with Palestinians, or move to the next stage of showing them the exit, the permanent exit from the Gaza Strip.
You mentioned the ceasefire agreement, so let's just spend some time on that. Netanyahu was in the US over the past few days. I didn't notice any optimistic signs that there will be any kind of ceasefire agreement. I mean, are we not still stuck in the same formula where Palestinians want a complete withdrawal of Israeli forces, Hamas, that is, wants a complete withdrawal of Israeli forces before it releases all the hostages? And Israel, of course, will not do that. And so are we not still in the same stalemate that we've been in over the past 20 months?
Yes, I mean the issue here, of course, is that the main party negotiating with Israel are not the Qatari and Egyptian mediators, but rather than the United States. And as we've learned over many decades, when it comes to the United States and agreements, particularly in the Middle East, most recently with the January ceasefire and then the negotiations with Iran. You cannot take the risk of trusting anything the Americans say or trusting any document that the Americans have endorsed and agreed to, because at the drop of the hat, they will turn around, shift the goalposts, abrogate the agreement, renounce things that they have signed, and so on. So they're, as should have been clear already decades ago, they're absolutely untrustworthy partners whose credibility is at best zero. Having said that, the US also acts in its self-interest and will reach agreements and will undertake commitments, at least on a temporary basis, if it feels that doing so serve its interests. And what we're seeing now, apparently, is an effort by the United States, for any number of reasons, to seek to conclude a new agreement between Hamas and Israel. Now there are, and this was in part an important reason for Netanyahu to travel to the United States. I think other issues had to do with Iran, with shoring up Israel's rapidly diminishing reputation among the American voters and so on. But there are essentially three sticking points that are still being discussed. The first is that what's on the table is a 60-day pause in the genocide. In other words, hostilities will be suspended, there will be an exchange of captives, and after 60 days, Israel will be free to resume and even to intensify its genocide and to conduct the kind of concentration camp plan that we've just discussed. That's Israel's demand. The Palestinians are insisting that the US publicly commit to ensuring that once a pause goes into effect, that will become a permanent ceasefire and not just a temporary suspension of hostilities. The second issue concerns the withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip. And Hamas is insisting that at the beginning of any new agreement, that Israeli forces at least withdraw to the positions they held before they resumed their genocidal military campaign in direct violation of the agreement that was reached in January and then abrogated by Israel and the United States on the 18th of March. And the third is that the Palestinians are insisting that leadership of the humanitarian assistance, the urgently required life-saving goods needed in the Gaza Strip, that this once again be led by the United Nations and qualified international organizations and not this Murder Incorporated that goes by the name of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. I personally would love to see the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and particularly all its senior officials remain in the Gaza Strip once, if and when a ceasefire is reached, and they can see just how grateful the Palestinians are for the hundreds and hundreds of Palestinians that they've murdered over the past month or two. But it's unclear whether the Palestinians are insisting that this gang of killers leave the Gaza Strip or just that other organizations who are properly qualified professional humanitarian agencies like United Nations agencies, Oxfam, Doctors Without Borders, Norwegian Refugee Council, World Central Kitchen, and so on, that they be allowed to conduct their operations unhindered. Because, of course, Israel's policy with total US support has been to eliminate the role of these organizations and to make the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation the exclusive and sole source of desperately needed food, which is only available in the kill zones it has set up for the Israeli military. So those are apparently the three issues that still need to be resolved. The U.S. Negotiator, Steve Witkoff, yesterday made a statement that there is only one issue remaining that needs to be resolved. He neither indicated which of the three issues is the one that remains to be resolved, nor how the other two have been resolved. So we can either take his statement at face value and see what happens in the coming days, or take it with a grain of salt. My suspicion is that the U.S. is, for a variety of reasons, seeking to persuade Israel to accept an agreement that is also acceptable to Hamas. And there are, for example, reports of the U.S. having given Israel informal commitment in writing that if an agreement goes into effect and Hamas does not disarm, and if Hamas leaders do not leave the Gaza Strip, which is something that's never going to happen, then the U.S. will support a renewal of the genocide by its Israeli proxy. But we'll have to see if an agreement does indeed emerge. There are other issues. There is growing pressure within Israeli society on the Israeli government to reach such an agreement. Israeli casualties have been escalating within the Gaza Strip, and there were two major incidents in the last week, which resulted in the killing of approximately 10 soldiers and the wounding of dozens. And there are growing attempts by Hamas to take Israeli soldiers captive. And this, I think, is important because Hamas is sending the message that if you do not want to conclude an agreement that results in an exchange of captives, then the alternative is that we will take additional soldiers prisoner to increase pressure on you to reach such an agreement. So whether they succeed in doing so, of course, is an entirely different matter. But that's kind of where we are with these negotiations. Again, the key sticking point will be a pause in the genocide or an end to the genocidal military campaign.
Mm. I mean, in the mind, I assume, given what the Israelis have been doing over the last couple of days, they seem to be accelerating the process of building this concentration camp. They closed down one of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation um, um, camps where they distribute food in central Gaza, which means Palestinians are increasingly being shepherded to southern Gaza. And it's increasingly looking like that this foundation is really, this main objective has nothing to do with aid, but it's really a vehicle or a tool for the Israeli military to advance this ethnic cleansing plan. So where before the UN organizations and all the other human rights organizations, they put humanitarian concerns at the top of their priority, the top of the priority of this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is how it can serve the Israeli army in expediting, accelerating the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, which is why they closed down one of their distribution facilities in central Gaza. And now a number of stories have emerged over the past week, one of the key ones being in the FT, which exposed this Boston consulting group who of being behind a modeling of the cost of relocating Palestinians from Gaza. This is the same consulting firm which helped establish the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and connected to that are other, some unsavory characters. Tony Blair Foundation. That foundation also took part in a meeting with the Boston Consulting Group for this ethnic cleansing project. Of course, Blair's team has come out and said that, no, we are not supporting any plan which leads to the ethnic cleansing or the displacement of the Palestinians. Right. They issued a statement, but I don't think many people are convinced by that. But in any case, there's a lot of unsavory characters that are behind this shadowy Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, whose fundings we don't really know. But what we do know is that it's been, many of its personnel are far-right Christian evangelical extremists, mercenaries, and hardcore Zionists. So just let's talk about that a little bit, the involvement of the Blair Foundation, and also the fact that there are some really nefarious shadowy group behind these organizations.
Well, Financial Times, to its credit, has been on this story from the outset and has published a number of detailed reports about this group and its exceptionally problematic nature, to put it politely. What we've learned in the past week is that Boston Consulting Group, which, by the way, is a organization for which the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu worked for some time in the 1970s or 1980s, if I'm not mistaken, that they have been much more deeply involved in designing this horrible scheme than they have been willing to admit. And they set up an office in Tel Aviv and so on. And they basically, Boston Consulting Group is claiming that a few rogue associates acted without authorization, and once they were found out, were fired. What the Financial Times has revealed is that they were there in full force from the outset. They set up an office in Tel Aviv. They helped design these kill zones. They helped design the funding model. This is essentially a Boston Consulting Group war crime, more than that of anyone else. And they knew they were acting at the direction of the Israeli military in order to help the Israeli military weaponize food, weaponize humanitarian assistance. In other words, it is a project not to assist people in need, but to manipulate people in need with essential supplies required for life. And then the other revelation from the Boston Consulting Group was that Tony Blair, who's apparently never encountered a war crime he can't resist. In this case, his group, presumably also for a generous sum of money, which is, of course, the other thing that has always attracted Blair, um, uh, made detailed proposals for what for what the Gaza Strip would look like after Israel completes its genocide. And it includes proposals like, for example, paying every Palestinian $9,000 to leave the Gaza Strip. I'm sorry, I'm not exactly sure if this was a calculation made on Israel's behalf by the Boston Consulting Group or the Tony Blair Institute. But there were calculations made of providing every Palestinian or every Palestinian family with $9,000 to leave the Gaza Strip, setting up an Elon Musk artificial intelligence park in the northern Gaza Strip, and other completely harebrained proposals that are never going to see the light of day. But, it helps prettify Israel's image. There's good money to be made in doing so, and it helps camouflage what is really happening, which is the mass murder of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip in an Israeli US supported genocidal military campaign.
And I think, given what we're witnessing at the moment, many people who a year and a half ago would have said, would never have imagined that Israel would build concentration camps in Gaza, have realized what this mission from day one has been about, that it is about ethnic cleansing and completing what Israel calls its Gaza problem. And one of those individuals, I guess, is someone by the name of Professor Eyal Benvenisti. So I raise this issue because he published an article this week. It was also published in the Harrods, a number of platforms, where he said that the concentration camp plan is clear violation of international law and war crime against humanity. And what's interesting is this Professor Ben Venisti, he was part of Israel's legal team defending Israel at the ICJ in the South Africa genocide case. So here we have someone, of course, many people have changed their views over the past 21 months. More recently, we saw podcast with Tony Blair's media advisor, Alistair Campbell.
Alistair Campbell,
He
yes.
came out just yesterday or the day before saying, he says, you cannot reach any other conclusion other than that Israel is committing genocide in Palestine, in Gaza. So he's the latest to basically admit to what many of us have been saying from day one, or even before day one. We knew that there was going to come a point where Israel would have to genocide Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank to realize this dream of greater Israel. That was always going to be the case. Now, slowly, more and more people like Alistair Campbell have acknowledged that. But what's interesting about this professor is that he was part of that team, and now he's saying that Israel's plan is a war crime. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, if only Alistair Campbell had pretended to have a conscience before being one of the chief spokesmen for the 2003 war crime and crime of aggression that was the invasion of Iraq. Look, as far as Eyal Benvenisti is concerned, what he says is really unimportant. Many other people have said the exact same thing, and in fact say it much better than he does. What is important here is the mere fact that Eyal Benvenisti is saying these things. As you pointed out, Eyal Benvenisti was a member of the legal team appointed by the government of Israel to represent it at the International Court of Justice against the case being brought by South Africa accusing Israel of genocide. So he's basically, or has been, an agent of the government of Israel in these legal proceedings. And he is now publishing an article accusing Israel of war crimes, explicitly so. And that, the image of rats scurrying off a sinking ship is the first thing that comes to mind. Eyal Benvenisti obviously believes that by publishing this article and having everyone talk about it the way we are, he will be remembered as the heroic figure who put his foot down and stood up to the Israeli government when it explicitly uh, took the decision to establish a concentration camp in Gaza Strip, rather than be remembered for going to The Hague to defend genocide. And he's probably looked at some other examples in history and doesn't want to be remembered in the same way. But it's too little, too late. Of course, everyone has the right to legal representation and all the rest of it. But when you voluntarily accept to defend a government that you know is engaging in genocide at the International Court of Justice, to basically denounce and defame uh, those who are accusing it of genocide, no amount of articles accusing Israel of war crimes is going to get you off the hook. This is not someone who is representing some poor soul who has been unjustly accused of petty theft at a supermarket. He knows exactly what he's doing, and he's doing this to try to save his reputation. And even if he writes 10 similar articles, it will do him absolutely no good.
Mm. Let's move away from Gaza in this part of the show. There was a story in the Wall Street Journal. I want to get your thoughts on that. It's not been covered by many other platforms, but many Israeli news agencies picked it up, and it's a strange one where it says where it revealed that a number of sheikhs, tribal leaders in Hebron, they're seeking to leave the Palestinian Authority and join the Abraham Accords. I mean, it's a really odd story, and I just get your thoughts on that. I mean, it sounds to me more like another proposal to divide and weaken
Mm.
the Palestinians. But I mean, what's going on here? I mean, what is the aim of these tribe leaders or sheikhs, as you'd call them, in seeking to
Mm.
move away from the Palestinian Authority and join the Abraham Accords? Is that even possible?
Well, it's for many years been my view that Israel's strategic priority with respect to the Palestinians is fragmentation. That is why, for many years, Israel tolerated Hamas rule in the Gaza Strip, despite its distaste for the movement, why it was continuously begging the Qataris not to sever their humanitarian and development assistance to the Gaza Strip. It's why Avigdor Lieberman, at the time he was Israeli defense minister, was literally begging the UN envoy to the peace process, the Dutch diplomat Robert Seri, to take suitcases full of cash to the Gaza Strip so there would be no economic collapse in the Gaza Strip. And, it was why Israel preferred Hamas in Gaza to the Palestinian Authority, even though the Palestinian Authority was actively collaborating with Israel and its security forces. What I think has changed is that in the decade after the Oslo Agreement, so let's say until the eruption of the Second Intifada in 2000, Israel wanted a strong Palestinian Authority because it wanted a credible counterpart who could sign a permanent agreement with Israel in which fundamental Palestinian rights would be renounced. What has happened in the quarter century since then is that Israel has, with very few exceptions, reverted to unilateralism. In other words, it has no need for a Palestinian negotiating partner. And it, in fact, finds increasingly the very existence of the Palestinian Authority to be a hindrance. Now, this is an institution that is being led by someone who, if I'm not mistaken, is around 90 years old, is not going to be around for another 90 years. And it's my view that once Abbas departs or is removed from the scene, that Israel will actively act to prevent the emergence of another national figurehead for the Palestinians, and will seek to intensify fragmentation within the West Bank. And this latest gimmick that you've asked me about is one such attempt. You know, these village leaders or whatever they are in the in the Hebron district, who have said they want to separate from the secede from the Palestinian Authority and reach peace agreements with Israel. No one has ever heard of them. They have no real authority. They're essentially Israeli collaborators and apparently are working closely with Israeli settler leader in the Hebron district. So it will have zero practical effect, but it needs to be seen in the broader context of the Israeli strategy of fragmentation and also of laying the groundwork for the formal annexation of growing parts of the West Bank. And one thing that we should also be looking for during Netanyahu's visit to Washington is whether Trump makes any announcement about U.S. recognition of Israeli annexation of West Bank territory.
Yeah, we've not heard anything about that, and we'll have to wait and see. But let's turn our attention to some of the other developments in the region. I think just recently the Houthis launched an attack on vessels in the Red Sea. So, I mean, why did the Houthis do that, given that there was a 12-day war between Iran and Israel, and there was a ceasefire? Why would the Houthis escalate at this moment? And also, I want to get your thoughts on this, talks of a deal with Syria, that the Syrian government will normalize relationship with Israel, and as part of that, the group which the Syrian president Ahmed al-Shara belongs to, Hayya Tahrir al-Sham, which was designated as a terrorist organization because of its affiliation with Al-Qaeda, will no longer be proscribed. So basically taken off the list of proscribed terrorist organization in the US. So there seems to be a deal that is being struck, and part of that would mean Syria normalizing ties with Israel. So thoughts on Syria and also the Houthi attack on the Red Sea.
Well, to take the Houthi attack first, as you know, after taking office, the Trump administration renewed the Biden administration's bombing campaign against Yemen, and in fact, intensified it very seriously. It failed to achieve anything, was costing a lot of money, and was putting U.S. material and personnel in growing danger. And the U.S. and the Houthis, the U.S. then concluded a ceasefire with the Houthis that basically, in which the Ansarullah, the Houthis, agreed to stop targeting U.S. ships and U.S. assets, but maintained the right continue to continue firing drones and missiles at Israel until a permanent end to Israel's genocidal military campaign in the Gaza Strip was reached. But as of the date of that ceasefire, they stopped all attacks on any shipping going through Bab el-Mandab, connecting the Arabian Sea to the Red Sea, and would only fire drones and missiles at Israel. And Israel conducted a few large bombing raids on Yemen. Now, in the past few days alone, the Houthis have attacked two ships, have boarded them, and have blown them up and sunk them to the bottom of the sea. And they are saying that these ships belong to companies that continue to service Israeli ports and therefore have no right of passage through Bab el Mandab. There could also be broader motives behind this. One could be to try, for example, to increase the pressure on the US and Israel in the context of these negotiations for a new ceasefire that we've just discussed. Another could be that, as you mentioned, the Houthis did very little during the US Israeli war on Iran and may now be also sending a signal that the axis of resistance remains and is neither intimidated nor incapable from conducting these kinds of attacks. So that would be my estimate of why we've seen this pretty dramatic escalation in activity by Ansarullah these past few days. Regarding Syria, the situation is much more murky. It's always difficult to take anything that Trump says seriously because he so often contradicts himself, within the space of 24 hours. But at the same time, one cannot also simply dismiss everything he says out of hand. And the US has been talking about an expansion of Arab Israeli normalization agreements. And it has been suggested that the new Syrian regime is prepared to normalize diplomatic relations with Israel. There's been talk of arranging a meeting between the current Syrian president, Ahmed al-Sharia, and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu at the General Assembly, that's the United Nations General Assembly session this September, and so on. My own sense is that the current senior leadership is not so naive that it can believe that it can conclude a full-scale normalization agreement with Israel while Israel remains not only in occupation of Syrian territory that it has seized since December 2008, but also while it continues to bomb Syria at will, and most importantly, while it remains in full control of the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, which it annexed in the early 1980s. I suspect what may be in the works is a kind of non-belligerency agreement between Syria and Israel that would require Israel to withdraw from the territories that it has occupied since December of last year and require the Syrians to commit not to launch any armed operations against Israel and to prevent any forces operating in Syrian territory from doing the same. If there's going to be more to it, it would absolutely require, I think, an at least very significant Israeli withdrawal from the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, because if it doesn't, it puts extreme pressure on the credentials of the current senior leadership, not only from Syrian society at large and Arabs more generally, but also from within its core constituency that I think would find it very difficult to accept and swallow such an agreement. And Sharia, and his group know this, which is why I kind of doubt all the very optimistic, from their point of view, sounds that are being made about an imminent and total Syrian capitulation to Israel. These are, of course, tied to broader issues. You mentioned the U.S. removal of the terrorist designations, the lifting of sanctions by the US and the European Union, and so on. I'm sure these are based, at least in part, on noises the Syrian leadership has been making about Israel, but they should also be seen in the context of US European competition about who gets the upper hand in Syria and trying to limit the role of the Russians and the Chinese. But the idea that Syria is the Syrian leader, whoever he is going to get up, publicly embrace Israel, announce total capitulation, and essentially recognize the illegal Israeli annexation of key Syrian territory. I don't see it happening.
And returning to the question about Hayya Tahrir Sham being delisted or removed from the terror list, I assume when the Americans do that, the Europeans and the Brits will also follow, which I guess underlines just how politicized the
Oh,
term
yes.
terrorism is, and which brings me to my next question about Palestine Action, which has been prescribed as a terrorist organization here in the UK. So now, Palestine Action is the same as ISIS. It's the same as Hayat Tahrir Shams. That's the designation that this government has given.
Well, it's
And
not the same as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham because Palestine Action, of course, are dangerous terrorists, and of God are now the good guys.
yeah, I mean, just to give a bit of backdrop to that as well. I mean, this is also the same week where the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, I mean, the occupied West Bank and Gaza, Francesca Albanese, she published a report where she documented all the different organizations, a real matrix of the organizations that are behind the Gaza genocide. Of course, you've got the usual weapons manufacturers, but at the same time, you've got household names like AI companies, Palantir, Google, and whatnot. So many other names which you and I are familiar with. So at a time when the EU is seeking to also find ways to punish Israel for breaching the Israel-EU association agreement, which we spoke about last week, um, I can't see any European country moving ahead in punishing any companies or any firm which Francesca Albanese has listed, 60 or so companies has listed as playing a direct role in the genocide in Gaza. But at the same time, you've got Britain and other companies, other countries moving to prescribe peaceful Palestinian activists, and which is quite a shocking development here in the UK, where they're turning against their own citizens to protect Israel, but not moving against anyone or any companies which are behind the genocide in Gaza.
Yes, it's the Americanization of Europe. In the United States, it's perfectly legitimate to call for the destruction of the United States, but it's illegal to even boycott Israel, let alone take any action against it. And the United States has been this very strange entity where it's more protective of a foreign proxy than it is even of itself. In Europe, of course, Israel is and always has been Europe's favorite child. And so the idea that the European Union is now going to take meaningful measures against Israel, because of genocide, absolutely never going to happen. I think what we may see is some individual sanctions against particularly distasteful individuals. But the idea that the EU is going to suspend its association agreement with Israel or anything of the sort, absolutely out of the question. I mean, for God's sake, they're delivering Israel still with the arms to conduct this genocide. Um, they're the ones who have, for decades, ensured that the settlement enterprise is economically viable by welcoming illegal settlement products produced by illegal settlements into the European market with open arms. So, one has to understand um, Israel is Europe's favorite child, and like any parent, it would rather see itself destroyed than to see any harm done to not just any child, but the favorite child. And I think that's how we need to understand the European-Israeli relationship. Now, against this background, where the European Union won't do anything, and when it doesn't do anything, it will claim that it was unable to achieve consensus among its member states, and then it's left to individual states here and there, like Ireland, to say that it will no longer import goods from the occupied territories, which is important, but much less effective than any EU decision, of course. Against this background, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, Francesca Albanese, has just issued this devastating and in my view, crucially important landmark report. She publishes, I think, 2 reports a year, and this one is titled From Economy of Occupation to Economy of Genocide. And it looks at how genocide, like occupation, requires an economic infrastructure. You cannot conduct a genocide free of charge, and that there is a whole ecosystem of companies and so on whose participation is not only enabling this genocide and creating the conditions for Israel to perpetrate it, but that these companies are also profiting handsomely from their complicity in this genocide. And Albanese calls for these companies and their CEOs to be held accountable. Now, what I find, it's a devastating report, and I was listening the other day to an interview with a prominent British human rights lawyer. His name was Jeffrey Nice. His name is Jeffrey Nice, I believe. And he was making the point that while this is a crucially important report, we shouldn't expect, to see heads of companies indicted by the International Criminal Court or any of that. But what this report does do is it strengthens the case for national prosecutions in national courts around the world. And when a national court is undertaking these kinds of prosecutions, he added, it's much more difficult for the United States to bully national legal systems into dropping cases and so on, the way it has been trying to do with the ICC and the ICJ. And I think this report is important because, you know, decades and decades on from the Holocaust, Jewish groups, rightfully so, in my opinion, have still been shining the spotlight on companies, not only governments and concentration camp guards, but companies, public utilities, banks, and so on, that were profiting from the Holocaust, or even that were profiting from relations with Nazi Germany. And given that it has been pro-Israeli organizations in many cases who have pioneered this kind of corporate social responsibility in the sense of holding people complicit in one particular genocide, let's say, accountable for their role. It makes absolute sense that what is good for the goose is good for the gander. You can't say, I hate the fact that Company X was profiting from construction contracts for concentration camps in the Second World War, but I absolutely love the fact that Tony Blair and Boston Consulting Group is doing it in the Gaza Strip in 2025. You either have principles or you're an opportunist, and it is that simple. Now, last point that you raised concerns Palestine Action, which is a activist group in the UK, which has specifically targeted, if I'm not mistaken, Elbit Systems, a major Israeli defense corporation, which has facilities in Great Britain and has never killed anyone, has never injured anyone, it has never threatened anyone with physical harm, but it does carry out direct action against property that forms part and parcel of the infrastructure of genocide in the Gaza Strip. And most recently, if I'm not mistaken, they entered an RAF base and threw red paint on a British jet. This is not quite the mass murder of Yazidis and taking their women and girls as sex slave, or beheading hundreds of captured Iraqi Shia soldiers. But the British government has clearly decided that this represents a mortal danger to the national security of the United Kingdom, and has designated, and the British government um, submitted legislation to Parliament to designate Palestine Action as a terrorist group, thoroughly unprecedented. And like the good sheep that they are, the Labour Party parliamentary faction and the opposition gleefully went along with this, and it passed by a very large majority, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
You know, if this wasn't about Palestine, it would have never passed.
I
But
mean, we've seen
again, it's the
similar
favorite
campaigns.
child
Yeah,
syndrome.
this is another case of Israeli exceptionalism. There's been
Yes.
a number of cases historically where direct action groups have carried out similar, vandalism. You can say you can prosecute them for vandalism and damage to property, but they've never been prescribed in this manner. So this is a first where direct action group has been prescribed as a terrorist organization, and it seems
Yes, and
like we were losing a key essence of democracy just to
yes.
protect and preserve Israel.
Yeah, and there's a labor peer, I believe his name is Peter Hain, who
Yeah.
was active in another anti-apartheid movement, this one against white minority rule in South Africa, and he pointed out, that the groups he was involved in at the time carried out very similar actions, and also gave examples of other groups that carried out more violent actions, including things that today would qualify as terrorism, and weren't blacklisted in this way. But as you said, it's a Palestine exception. When you're supporting Palestinian rights in any way, shape, or form, you are by definition a terrorist. When you're applauding genocide, you're a human rights activist. That's the way the West works.
Mm. I mean, there has been pushback. Even the Times, which is usually a right-wing newspaper supportive of right-wing policies, has opposed this move, saying, this is a bit too much. But let's end on Trump being nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by Benjamin Netanyahu. And I
What
mean,
took so long?
what kind of world do you think? What kind of universe would are we living in where you can have someone who's wanted by the ICC for war crimes, crimes against humanity, supported by the American president, who is also supporting a genocide in Gaza, that he could nominate Trump for Nobel Peace Prize? I mean, what does it say about the moment we're living in at this current
Well,
moment
I
period?
personally, I had expected him to be nominated for the Nobel Prize for Medicine after, during COVID, he recommended that people drink chlorine, or take a chlorine enema. I can't remember which it was, to get rid of the virus. Um, as you may recall, a few weeks ago, Pakistan announced that it was nominating Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. And the rationale was that were it not for his intervention, India and Pakistan would have very rapidly escalated towards a nuclear confrontation. I don't think that was ever the case, but it gave the Pakistanis a nice opportunity to butter up to Trump, given their concerns of the increasingly close relationship between the U.S. and India. Regarding this, Netanyahu understands his counterpart well. Trump is a totally self-obsessed narcissist who has a particular obsession with the Nobel Peace Prize. First of all, because it's a prize he hasn't yet received. Second of all, because it's prestigious. And third, and perhaps most importantly, because his nemesis, and arguably the person he hates most on this entire planet, Barack Hussein Obama, as he always calls him, um, received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009, and received it for absolutely nothing he had done. The only reason Obama received the prize was for not being George W. Bush. And so I can understand why Trump would think, well, if you gave it to Obama for achieving absolutely nothing, why can't you give it to me after I concluded a ceasefire between India and Pakistan and bombed nuclear facilities in Iran? But from Israel's perspective, it makes sense to butter up to this narcissist and to play to his weakness, and then hope you get something in return.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know who else is going to jump on this bandwagon. I can't imagine. I mean, who knows? I mean, there's so
Well,
many things happening.
maybe the new NATO
That's
Secretary
right.
General Mark Rutte, who already refers to Trump as daddy, maybe he will get NATO governments to collectively nominate Trump as well. Give it, and do so because of the bombing of Iranian nuclear facilities. You never know in this world.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Moin. That was my
Thank you.
guest, Mouin Rabbani, joining me for our weekly review of Palestine. Thank you for tuning in. And I'll see you again next week for another episode of Palestine This Week. Bye bye.